Now, you might think that a Kiwi farmer giving Australians tips on drought-proofing their properties is a bit like shipping coal to Newcastle. But Doug Avery's not your average New Zealand lamb and beef producer. He and his family turned conventional pastoral practices on their head and in doing so turned around the fortunes of their farm on New Zealand's South Island. Doug Avery was a guest at this week's Queensland AgForce conference, and Landline executive producer Pete Lewis caught up with him in Brisbane.
Doug Avery, welcome to the Landline.
Oh, thank you very much.
Anyone who's developed a taste for New Zealand's Sauvignon Blanc will know about the Marlborough region, but just tell us exactly where it is and how dry it is.
I'm from Marlborough, which is the northern part of the South Island on the eastern side. We've got the Southern Alps that basically stop the westerly systems coming across. Cook Strait, which is like a wind funnel, so we get high evapotranspiration and very little rain. The average rainfall where I am farming is 573. But for a period of 19 years, we had 17 of those years where we didn't get our average rainfall, and that's really serious for us. Yeah.
Now, prolonged drought is not exactly a term we normally associate with New Zealand. How did that influence the way you operated your lamb and beef business?
That period of 17 years was catastrophic on us. I think no matter where you are, the real essential part of your business is averages. And if you go under your average for a prolonged period of time, you tend to have a major impact. What actually happened with us is we ended up running half our capital stock that we'd normally had, and it affected us environmentally, it affected us financially, and of course when those two things start to fail, it also affected us socially.
So what was the light bulb moment?
I got pretty down about where things were. I thought I was smart enough to farm pretty successfully. And one day a guy asked me if I'd come to a seminar in Christchurch where a guy called Dr. Derek Moot, who was a senior plant scientist at Lincoln University, was giving an address. And I was very reluctant to go, but in the end I did go. Our family had been growing lucerne for 80 years, and that day Moot dropped the pennies through the slot that connected the lucerne plant to a grazing system and to basically a process that changed my life. And
it turned your operation around?
Our operation went from one where effectively we were making no money at all to one where we're in the top few percent in New Zealand sheep and beef in returns. Yeah.
Well, thinking outside the square can often be viewed very sceptically by neighbours and fellow primary producers. Was the Farmer of the Year award a vindication of your approach and perhaps an incentive for others to follow you?
When I first started doing it, I became basically the laughing stock of the area. One guy nicknamed me in a bit of a press release that he put out, the lucerne lunatic, and I was actually delighted about that because it drew a lot of attention to what I was doing, and I realised that I was designing a system in collaboration with a lot of other people. Progressively, people went quiet. And then the adventurous ones started to join us, and now it's really like a tide in the drier parts of New Zealand. So it's quite exciting, really. I'm directly integrating with huge numbers of farmers across the drier parts of New Zealand.
And you're sharing some of that wisdom with the driest continent on earth as well, with Australian farmers.
Well, I'm actually quite pleased to do that because right at the early stages of things, there wasn't much point in me going around New Zealand looking for guidance. And I came to Australia and I was talking to a guy one day and he said, "Doug, the cheapest place to save moisture is where it lands." And that was a great turning point in my head. I thought, I've actually got to start learning about soils, I've got to learn about plants, and I've got to learn about systems which are not being used now because the model of farming that was being implanted around New Zealand had failed. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got.
Well, look, speaking of hoping for the best but preparing for the worst, the Rugby World Cup's on, and at that level, of course, it's been a very dry old argument for the All Blacks. Has their time come in 2011?
Of course, you've got a decent coach this time. I think that will be a huge advantage to Australia. But, you know, you've got Iani out already and another couple of tough games. You know, some of those young fellas aren't looking very robust. And, you know, I guess at this stage I'm hoping for a All Black Wallaby final. They're the two best teams in the competition, and I think on the day it'll come down to an absolute sizzler. And, you know, 5 minutes to go. Dan Carter this time will drop a goal and we'll be home.
Hang on to those dreams. Thanks for joining us on Landline.
Yep, not a problem. Thank you.